the fourth book of the Earth Chronicles, The Lost Realms. It's probably the Ancient Alien Theorist book that I agree the most with. Now, I don't think necessarily that Virukochu, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan is necessarily going to come back, or that it was anything in the first place, except maybe a spiritual encounter. But the idea that the old world and the new world were connected seems to be more and more supported. The idea that Lake Titicaca was the origin of the Andean civilization as we know it, going back, about 17,000 years, that kind of makes sense. The fact that they've aligned their city, they aligned a series of cities in the direction of the ocean, a particular degree angle, and other, and the metallurgy and stuff like this. The fact that it was very complex, some of it, or it took a lot of trial and error, doesn't mean that aliens needed to teach us it. How can modern human, with our smaller brain and probably less patience and less intelligence, although smaller brain size isn't necessarily an indication of intelligence, actually, but, how can we look at these things and figure it out as modern humans that don't spend as much time on serious things, on spiritual things, and say, oh no, they couldn't have figured it out. They couldn't have there couldn't have been psychological similarities between them. There couldn't have been, no, they couldn't have had spiritual experiences. But the peak of this of the Lost Realms is, for me, is actually how it talks about Job. In the book of Job, you got silver, gold, iron, and tin, and Lake Titicaca is actually, Tiwanaku is the site, that they actually had all four of these together. And Tiwanaku, coming from a Sumerian root of, city of tin, Tiwanaku, that makes sense. So does the fact that legends from Ur, where Abraham was from, speak of two cities of tin. Two mountains of tin, and one of them was in Bolivia. And there's a lot of interesting, shaped blocks. What knocked them down? Now, I don't buy this worldwide flood thing, but, coastal flood, maybe. Now, Latter-day Saints are going to tell you, or they might tell you, that Quetzalcoatl and such things was it's really Jesus, some of these things, but the dates don't line up as precisely as people think. The Jericho and the sun and the moon and whatnot pausing may line up with Mesoamerican stories of the same sort. And, 3113 BCE being a starting point lines up with some other stuff. There's this myth of how do they shape this Cyclopean architecture at Sacsayhuaman and other places where the blocks are like as many as 12-sided and they're giant blocks, and they move them from 10 miles away. some places it's moved uphill, and it's like, how in the world did they move these things weighing tens of tons and all this other stuff? Some of them bigger than modern cranes, but well, it's like at Baalbek, which is also thought to be a spaceport, but it doesn't have to be a spaceport. It turns out that they probably used a whole series of cranes, because you don't just look at one thing, you look at the other, and, you know, of course there's the idea of this lost city of gold. They used a more, the gold rush in America operated different than a lot of the ancient mining. A lot of the ancient mining, they dug down deep into the earth and went at it that way rather than panning for gold like was typically done. But I'm sure some of that was done too, and there was a change in some places. Oh, the gold's for the god. Well, why do these so-called gods need gold? Well, again, this can be a thing of worship. But the founding of Cusco, the Incan Empire, this guy, it was supposed to be done with a golden wand, and the golden wand was also the way that the stones were shaped, and this one of the golden tears. I agree with that being a thunder deity, and thunder and wind, and it's like, really? Two cultures can't decide. We don't want one god. We want a god of the wind and the thunder and all this other stuff. And oh yeah, they can shape metals and do other things that we want. So whether or not they actually can, or could, that doesn't matter as much. But yeah, there is the belief of that returning. But it could, again, like many other things, be divinized human beings. People accomplished things, or people from other lands were able to do things, and over time they were considered as divinities. It's like in the Celtic world, the Norse, which are the northern, Teutonic people, came down, and some of them got eventually treated as, the Jesus and the Mary and whatnot of that ancient world. The Balaam story, there's a, sorcerer, the Balaam, and it's, spoke about on both sides, and some of the Native American stories, by Native American, I mean Incan and all the the people of the Americas, actually included things that made sense when translated into Sumerian and Akkadian and Mediterranean sort of languages, and vice versa. Some of the things made sense when you look at, oh, what's going on over here, and there was actually legends about, oh, well, they got it, they crossed there's an ocean on the other side of Africa, and there's a place, and there's a body of water inside this large island, and that's sort of how Lake Titicaca worked. One thing that kind of does get proven wrong, okay, August 13th, 3113 BCE, it's when the long count Mayan calendar started. A whole lot of days. I mean, why did they keep track of all that stuff? It was weird because short-term accuracy wasn't terribly good, but long-term was just incredible. Yes, to mark out spiritual experiences. As a farmer, the exactness of the time and whatnot, a lot of people without a calendar, oh, it's getting cold, it's getting warm, it's getting brighter, the day's getting longer, whatever. They could tell to enough of a degree that they didn't need that accurate of a calendar, particularly when you're throwing in the moon cycle and you look up, and in predicting women, that also doesn't seem as likely of a source of predict of the origins of the calendar, because if you're not sexually repressed and you're not sick or something, you can go up and touch a woman and you can know where she's at, and that's why, you know, that's why a lot of women want their hands held and stuff, because they don't want to. On some level, they know, hey, I'm telling either my husband or, you know, someone who's taking care of me that here's where I'm at, you know, so react accordingly. So you don't necessarily need to predict that, but there's benefits to predicting. And they did believe that something came across the, you know, across the sea. And why did the ancients know about this and we didn't? I mean, it was obviously the Vikings weren't the first. It turns out there was even people writing ogams before the Vikings arrived in America, and it turns out that also the Arabs and the Turks made their way over in the early Hijra years, and long before, it appears that the Egyptians and stuff made their way back and forth. But people responded to those things in the heavens, and that was why, you know, they changed their life and they changed their societies based on what was in the heavens. But I would also remind you, oh, the mark of Cain is the absence of facial hair. Stop watching movies and television shows and think you know history based on the movies and the television shows. Yes, only old world people grow facial hair. But the old world people descended from the new world people descended from the old world people. 25,000 years ago, there were Europeans on the eastern coast of America, as far south as Florida. And I guess like down into Mexico too. But Florida for sure, certain. The Smithsonian's been saying this for a long time. There's some things being said in this book that, you know, I didn't hear about for over a decade. You know, this is a 1990 book. Because it wasn't, largely because of the Ancient Alien thing, I think. Because when I look at the scene Edmond Bordeaux Szekely books, I definitely see how there was a lot of stuff that ended up in those books, but it wasn't taken as seriously until the Da Vinci Code, which is fiction. I mean, the Little House on the Prairie was probably more based in reality than that, but you know, people didn't take it as seriously because it was you know, the guy started his own cult based on comparative religions and all that. And the Ancient Aliens thing is the same way, even though Zecharia Sitchin is rather, and he ignores sort of the more spiritual, psychological explanations for these things in favor of, and that scientifically some of the stories just don't pan out. Either the connections are not, you know, not as clear as they would have them say, or they're, the details in the story make it just not work as a physical thing, unless you're talking about exaggerations. And going to the Magical Egypt series, the point is sort of made that in places there, you had a super advanced society in terms of technology and even mythology and stuff, and then it degrades. That case is not made so much in Zecharia Sitchin's Lost Realms book in terms of the culture of the Americas, is that generally you had development. And then again, if you had development and they arrived there maybe 40,000 years ago, 30-something thousand years ago, some of these finds in South America, you know, really they couldn't take 15,000 years to develop some of the technology that was developed over the course of thousands of years. in other parts of the world. I just don't buy that. Our ancestors were very intelligent. We should look at their myths because they're saying something. A lot of it's exaggeration. It's like you know, I don't have I have a couple volumes of the set. But Ibn Kathir takes stories of the Quran that the modern science doesn't do anything. But this was a long time ago, and exaggerating and saying the world's on the back of a giant whale, and oh, this from here, well, he came from the cleft of the rock. How does his camel turn from a rock if the wording is the same with a person walking through the rock and a rock, So and there's some other stuff that some commentators have said, ooh, let's make this more marvelous or more spectacular, and then they turn it into something that couldn't have happened, or something that could have only happened with very specific divine intervention that goes against the laws of nature. And I'm not even certain that we need to go to the extent that miracles are outside the law of nature. They may be rare, but anyways, I'm rambling here, and hopefully this one sticks.